Okay, so I wanted to make another video talking about how these DNA tests can be misleading and sort of elaborate on those points. Okay, so someone could have US roots, okay, but have more, remote originators in the average populations in like Britain, Scotland, Ireland, right? Populations I just call Yanks, right? Like I have US roots, but my originators have more Creole heritage, right? While some people have US roots, they have their originators were more Yank. Or I use Dixian if they have more Southern US heritage. But these Yanks, right, they get a DNA test and they get like 70, 80, 90% British. Okay. Well, these Yanks could actually be used as a reference population. And let's say the average Brit, right, with more current and remote, British roots, the average Brit. This average Brit could take a DNA test and they could get 70, 80, 90% Yank. Okay, that's 100% possible right now. These companies are just choosing to use certain populations as a reference population. They could use Yank as a reference population, and this average Brit would get 70, 80, 90% Yank. And it would kind of make sense on some level because we kind of understand what you're getting at, and it's kind of true. This average British person's um, genetic pattern is very similar to Yanks, which is why you're getting those percentages. It's just 100% a choice to use these certain populations as a reference population. I mean, I get it, it makes some sense on some level, but at the same time, it just has that sort of old world, new world vibe where it's like as if like these old world populations were frozen in time and then reality sort of revolves around these new worlders and that we just sort of originate from these old world these old worlders when we all just originate from these more remote populations. Okay, but that's just what's happening. Okay, we're just doing it in reverse. Okay, they're using them as a reference population and you're getting 70, 80, 90% Yank, which makes some sense on some level. We kind of understand it, but would they really be 70, 80, 90% British or Yank? No. So are you really 70, 80, 90% British? No, not really. Yes, a lot of Yanks would get British percentages, but not that much. Okay. And what I wanted to show is that it's totally possible and that these Yanks are detectable as a distinct genetic population, right? So this is sort of a plot that shows the genetic distance between populations. And like TSI says it's Tuscany in Italy, okay? And IBS are Iberian populations in Spain. So you can see the genetic distance between these two populations, okay? And they're fairly genetically close, probably because, they both originate from these early Romance speakers in a sense. But we can see here, so GBR are like these average British populations, and CEU is basically Yanks, right? They took DNA from populations in Utah, okay? And you can see that there's this overlap there, this strong overlap, but at the same time, they are detectable as distinct genetic populations. So we could use Yanks, right? Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, could use Yanks as a reference populations that everyone else's DNA is going to be compared to, and these other populations around the world could get Yank percentages, and it would kind of make sense, and it would be kind of true. but it wouldn't really be that sensible. Okay, but the same thing's just happening in reverse. It kind of makes sense. It's kind of true, but not really. Really, you would get Yank percentages, right? You would get some British percentages, but you would get a lot more um, Yank. But they're not using Yank um, data sets in the reference population. Okay. Another way we can look at it is, so ASW is basically like these African American identified populations, or I just say Creole because it's more, accurate and sensible, right? Atlantic Creoles, US Creoles. And these are sort of populations that have historical inhabitants in Africa, right? Why are that's basically Yoruba tribals, okay? So you can see that US Creoles are fairly genetically distant from these populations, okay? ACB, that's like Barbados, like Caribbeans, people with that sort of Caribbean Creoles, okay? So one thing you can see there is kind of misleading how it's kind of presented as if we are genetically close to these populations, even though we're not. Okay. And yes, we are kind of pulled away from these populations because we have this sort of admixture from these more, GBR associated and other populations similar to them, right? And, um, but we're also sort of admixed with a lot of these populations, which pulled our genetic distance further. But then DNA is always changing, right? A little bit of bottleneck things going on there too as well. So we're fairly genetically distant from these populations. But these DNA tests will make you almost believe that that you're very genetically similar to these populations when we're not. But the same thing could happen, right? They could use Creoles as a reference population, and then an average Yoruba tribal could get their DNA tested and they could get 60, 70, 80% Creole. They're just choosing to use them as a reference population, so we're getting that because our DNA is genetically similar to theirs. Okay. And it kind of works in a similar fashion to, shades of color. Okay. So one way to talk about this is I saw someone with sort of Cajun origins. I saw their DNA results and they got about 80% French. Are they genetically 80% French? Not really. They would be they would should be genetically Cajun, correct? Okay. Um so not really. So what's happening there is, like, let's say this shade of blue is sort of Cajun DNA, okay? And this shade of blue is more average associated French DNA. Okay, so they could put this Cajun DNA as a reference population, and then they would get Cajun percentages, but they're not choosing to, and they're going to align you with the closest shade of blue. Okay, so I mean, it could even almost be over here. Okay, so this is like Cajun genetic patterns. They're going to put you with the closest shade of blue. So you're getting these, right? They scan your DNA. It looks like this, but they are going to compare it to the closest blue that they can. So they say this. So you get, 10% French. Scan it again, 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, all the way to 80. Are you genetically this color? So even though they're saying your DNA looks like this, even though it looks like this, because they're just saying that's the closest shade that we have to this. So no, that person is not 80% French. Okay, within this framework, because then it's not It's not literal. This is more theoretical. Okay. You can't you can't genetically be a continent. It's a made up territorial boundary. It's imaginary. You can't genetically be a country. Again, it's just a made up territorial boundary. It's just a logical construct. It's just an imaginary construct. DNA is material. That's logical. It's imaginary. You can't be that. You can't even genetically be a so-called ethnicity, a tribe, or a culture. Those are social, right? Those are also sort of imaginary constructs, but they're also sort of social activity, and your DNA can't absorb or become social activity. Okay. But we are just correlating uh, genetic patterns with, you know, historical cultures, essentially, okay, and places. Um, we're just correlating genetic patterns with these imaginary constructs, essentially, but which can be sensible on some level. But this is sort of the current results frameworks, how it's presented is only like semi-sensible. Okay. But it could be more sensible. Now, another thing, so that's the case with these other things as well. So another thing to consider is um so a lot of people are approaching this as as if DNA works like Legos when it doesn't. This is so we can say distinct genetic patterns, but they are sort of being um, merged at a molecular level. Okay, people say it's like it's in the same way people are like, yeah, I'm white and black. Okay, so even if race was real, no, you're not white and black. Okay, you would be gray. People take it as if there's a white Lego and there's a black Lego, and you click them together. But that's not what it's like. It's more like melting a black and white Lego together to create a new Lego, and that Lego would be gray. Okay. So, but we could use technology to look at that gray Lego and say, oh, we can detect some black Lego and some white Lego, and it's about 50-50. And that's kind of what these companies are doing. So even if you're getting those percentage, if you're getting different percentages, you're not genetically, you're not that. It's just showing you the origins of that, right? In the same way, you're not a white and black Lego, you're a gray Lego, if that makes sense, okay? But the point of that is that this same sort of color thing is happening with all these other things. So you can see that these Yanks are genetically distant from these populations that they're giving them percentages to. It's the same thing. So it's detectable that your DNA is this color, but this color is not in the database, so they're giving you the next closest color, so they're giving you this color. Even though your DNA doesn't look like this, your DNA looks like this. But there could almost be a finer. I'm just using this as an example, but just imagine, because you again, you can even see that you are very genetically similar to them, or some of your DNA genetic pattern or genetic origins, I guess you could say. But if there was like one something even finer than this, I guess, I guess you can use this more like this, right? So yank genetic patterns, some certain average British genetic patterns. They're saying your DNA looks like this, but looks like this. It's detectable as something different. It's distinct. Okay. And in some cases, they can put that in the database, and you could get those percentages. You could get Yank percentages, Creole percentages. Okay. I mean, it could might be a little harder in some cases, but like for Icelanders, that could be very easily. They're just choosing not to. Because again, this is like genetic distance between populations. And you can see like this is like Norway, Sweden, Denmark associated populations. You see how genetically similar they are, and there's all this overlap, which is why sometimes you'll get, percentages that, uh, sometimes it'll be misinterpreted or it's hard to distinguish, but they still choose to separate them into these distinct categories. But look how distinct the average Icelandic genetic pattern is. Okay, and yet there's no Icelandic category or label, right? And then if you look at those people who get tests, they get like these different percentages, but you could easily get 70, 80, 90% Icelandic, but they're just choosing not to because I guess it's just not as, you know, it, they don't, it would be less exciting, I guess, right? And they're trying to sell a product. It will be less buzzwordy. Like, and they just know people seem to want to, it's like we're almost obsessed with collecting as many labels as we can, something around that, and that they couldn't cater to that sort of, you know, accumulation, consumerism, whatever thing we're doing these days. Okay. But yeah, that's the thing there. Okay. So another thing I wanted to talk about